retain the right to vote. But the Mississippi legislation disenfranchised 4 out of 5 white Mississippians as well. It was basically an effort to restrict the vote to white property owners and the white middle class. Blacks lost all legal protections, so they were completely vulnerable to any white who wanted to take advantage of them economically or simply to hurt them for no particular reason at all. Now, why did these changes happen at this particular time, with the 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century? Some 20 plus years, 25 years after the end of the Civil War. The reason in Tennessee is very clear. There was a closely contested election between farmers' groups on the one hand and more corporate groups on the other hand, in which the black vote, the black farming vote, tipped the scale temporarily to the white, to the populists, to the farmers' movement. The idea that the black vote could be decisive in the election, in an election, was something that those who had been in charge of the South took as a very serious threat. What if black farmers and poor white farmers banded together? Would black voters then become a decisive factor in other contests? So the response in the Tennessee legislature was to make sure that the election results of 1888 would not be repeated in 1890. So by disenfranchising black voters, the political contest became a white-white contest, with the more privileged whites having a slight advantage in that case. Mississippi is a similar case where the farmers' movement was particularly virulent, particularly radicalized, and looked like it could take control of the state. By disenfranchising, in this case, in Mississippi's case, not only all black voters, but a majority of white voters, those who were in control of Mississippi were making sure that they retained control of the state. No, they didn't do it in the name of it's our Mississippi belongs to us and we're not going to let go of it. They did it on the basis of it's wrong to have illiterates voting. So we should eliminate anybody from the rolls who can't pass a simple reading test. And then the county election, the county clerk would determine who passed the test. So it was built in that if you were not respectable enough, you were going to be disenfranchised. There were variations on this throughout the South in terms of determining that blacks would be eliminated from the political process altogether as voters and not simply as members of government. There were also good character and mental competency tests that were sometimes used. And then in Texas pioneered what was called an all-white primary, in which the primaries were viewed as the private activities of members of a private association, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And so the Democratic Party could decide that only whites could vote in its primary. And thus, and since, given the nature of politics in Texas, whoever won the Democratic primary was going to win the general election. So it was a series of different strategies for assuring a greater continuing control over the state government. So in Louisiana in 1896, there had been 130,000 registered black voters. By 1904, there were 1,342, which was more typical of the South. Mississippi's laws reduced the number of black voters to less than 200 at any given time. And Mississippi was also developed what in effect was an absolute racial dictatorship with continuing patterns of daily violence. But Georgia had the highest rate of lynchings in the South. And in Georgia, some counties required blacks who wanted to travel to get a pass from the county sheriff. So but that was a development that came after black voters were disenfranchised. So once black voters were disenfranchised, then came legislation in each state to mandate segregation. So there was legislation mandating segregated railroads, segregated schools, then segregated libraries, segregated hotels, restaurants, hospitals, asylums, prisons, theaters, parks and playgrounds, cemeteries, toilets, sidewalks, drinking fountains, and nearly every other place where blacks and whites might mingle. The idea of this was that blacks and whites would never be occupying the same space under any conditions as equals. Blacks would always be clearly in a subordinate position. If they were doing something, like even going to the toilet or drinking some water, if you're just doing that, you didn't want blacks and whites there both doing the same thing. They had to be in separate locations. If they were to be in the same location, it would be clear that the black was there in order to serve somebody who was white. Are there any questions about this before I go on? I'm sure you had to have learned a lot about Jim Crow. So what I'm trying to do is help you see the chronology of this, and also to propose some explanations that go beyond just prejudice. That this was a question of political contests, but also of economic interests. By 1915 is when Texas adopted the Jim Crow system and was the last place in the South to do so. You had every state in the South having a formal system of disenfranchisement and segregation. And these were laws that would stand until they were overthrown by the action of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. So out of this, dominance by a narrow group of well-off white Democrats was guaranteed. Indeed, since in many states poor whites also lost the vote as a result of the new statutes, challenges to the rule of wealthy whites was largely eliminated. So, how did I want to move on to the resistance to Jim Crow. The exclusion from political life meant that African American public life was limited to the schools, the Negro colleges as they were called, to the African American church, and to clubs. And particularly the first resistance to Jim Crow came from women's clubs, African American women's clubs in the South. Ida B. Wells on the right became the leader, the first national leader of an anti-lynching movement, because the imposition of Jim Crow was also accompanied by a growth in the number of lynchings that took place. And she was a newspaper editor in Memphis, Tennessee, where Tennessee was the first state where the Jim Crow legislation took place, and also the place where lynching increased most dramatically initially. She began to write exposés of the lynchings, not simply to get debate within Tennessee, but to get national debate. She was arguing for Congress to send federal troops back into the South whenever citizenship rights were being restricted, and whenever the local governments or the state governments could not control lynching. As a reward for her good efforts, her newspaper building was burned down, and she had to escape from Memphis literally by being packed into a steamer trunk and put on a boat that went up to Illinois. She barely escaped with her life. And the Southern leaders were using the fact that they could chase her out of the South as an example to everyone else that if you tried to protest, you would either be dead or you would have to move to the north. She did move to the north. She went to Chicago. She married a real estate developer, and she started a new newspaper in the Chicago African American community. She became very wealthy, very successful, and remained a national figure in the civil rights movement. But she largely functioned as an individual, not as the leader of a group. Charlotte Forten Grimke was a leader, African American leader in the women's club movement and in the women's church movement, missionary movement. And one of the results of the repression was that the churches and the women's club movements, while they continued to protest, their protests became more genteel, more restrained. So they would try to bring attention to problems, but they had, in order to retain some semblance of normal life in their homes, they had to